welcome to the Lean on Agile show. I'm your host, Shaheen, and I have a dear guest today with me, Mike Burrows. He doesn't need any introduction. Mike, thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, Shaheen, and hi, everybody, and thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit who Mike is.
Oh, well, I'm old enough for that to be a long story. I mean, I don't know whether this will work backwards or work forwards. I mean, working forwards, degree in maths. I went into embedded software, worked on aircraft simulators to start with. So I was very into the sort of engineering side of things, the mathematical side of things, technical stuff. Multi-processing was, a new thing when I started, believe it or not. And then I got very much into the architecture and the process of it all. And when I left aircraft simulation, I went into software tools at a time when sort of case tools was like the exciting place to be. And then the market for the case tools kind of imploded. And I kind of don't regret it in a way. What happened was the integrated development environment, very much better editing tools, open source tools, the whole thing. And suddenly developers were able to look after themselves. And and actually, the nuts and bolts of development got a lot more effective. But I'm still very interested in the process side of things. I moved into investment banking in terms of the work I was doing. I actually worked for 3 different investment banks as a developer, and then I worked my way up through the ranks in Swiss Bank, which then merged with UBS. Was a global development manager, executive director, all that kind of stuff. I actually had a really enjoyable career, and then the credit crunch came, and probably the less said about that, the better. But it was one of the most intense times of my career. I was still managing a global team at a part of the business that really was central to the whole credit, whole credit crisis. So eventually, after more than a year of sort of dealing with all of that, I left, moved fairly quickly to be a CTO of a late stage startup, and saw that through to its exit, which was good. And then I actually had the time to think about what I wanted to do next. And I decided I didn't want to go back into finance. It was still a difficult area to be working in. We decided to move away from London. I moved to the countryside, which is nice. The startup was actually based in Budapest, in Hungary. So I was doing a week away, a week at home, week away, a week at home. A year and a half of that was plenty. And I moved into consulting, and I thought it'd be great, consulting, training, coaching, all those kinds of things. I found it just great to feel like I had a bit more control of my own destiny. And then there was like a blog post that sort of changed everything, introducing Kanban through its values. Wrote it over the New Year's holiday 2013, and it just exploded. I mean, it's 9 years now since I wrote that blog post, and still, year on year, it's one of my most popular blog posts. Most of the years since 2013, it has still remained the most popular blog post of that year, which is just extraordinary. And it led to the book, my first book, Kanban from the Inside. So the first 9 chapters of that book were each focusing on one of the 9 values of my values model. And that values model is now it was embraced very quickly by the Kanban community. It's now sort of a formal part of the Kanban method, and different people have done different things with them. And what was important about values is that, they explain so much in a non-prescriptive way, and it was the start of a process for me of looking at how can we be non-prescriptive about Agile, and then stepping back even further from there, how can we not be non-prescriptive about change and transformation? And actually, most of what I've been doing for the last 5-6 years or so has been very much focused on how do we do change in a way that's not about rollout, not about imposition. Agile being something that happens to you is a pretty awful way of approaching Agile, pretty not in keeping with really its underlying principles. And it turns out that not only is rolling out Agile an agile way of doing things, that actually the organization development community had come to the same realization. even before Agile was the thing. And kind of Agile, I feel, has ignored 20 years worth of organization development, learning and knowledge, still stuck in models from the 90s in terms of how to do organizational change. And I found that the work I've done is actually converging back into the organizational development world. I've connected my work to the work of other respected figures in the OD world. I've even been commissioned to write a 4th book. And it's very much feeding into the sort of academic OD community, which is really quite, I feel, it's obviously gratifying to be asked to do something like that. So I've been on quite a journey, from being, hardcore engineering through to process methods, all that kind of stuff. And then sort of stepping back from that and thinking, well, how can we start a process of change that starts with the conversations that we need to have and finding out the needs we want to meet, agreeing on the outcomes we want to achieve, rather than starting from the point of view that I know better than you, I know what's wrong with you, do this and live with the consequences, which seems a pretty rubbish way of doing anything, and a pretty rubbish way of doing Agile, most especially.
Such a unique and pretty journey that you had, like from
Yes, looking backwards. Looking backwards, it makes sense, but there's no way I could have predicted, any stage that, where it would take me. So that's all part of the fun of life, I guess. But I've never been afraid to get out of my comfort zone. We can say that much about me.
I have some friends in the financial domain, and I know that investment banking, one of the most stressful, if I'm not like the most stressful part of the financial domain they are in. Yeah. So and you were in 3 of them. So how did you survive?
I worked for one of the worst, which no longer exists. I would say one of the worst, one of the most aggressive, but I mean, it was famously aggressive. It used to make loads of money one year and then lose it all the next. So his whole attitude to life was, we're going to take risks. It kind of led to a culture of paranoia. People were taking such big positions that they didn't even want their neighbors on the trading floor to know what they were doing.
Right.
And it's very hard to work in a collaborative way with people when they are afraid of, news of what they're up to getting out. I did a 3-month contract. I won't name the bank, but if you know the banks in 2000, if you know what banks have ceased to exist since 2019, since 1996, with a reputation for aggression, you can probably guess who it might have been. I was offered a permanent job at the end of it, but I turned it down. I then went to Credit Suisse, which I quite enjoyed, but it wasn't quite what I was looking for. And then I went to Swiss Bank, and I found an organization that, yes, investment banking is a very competitive business, but that doesn't mean that internally you can't be in an organization that actually really cares for developing people, for giving teams autonomy and things like that. And actually, even in the late 90s, actually run on what you could say was quite, agile principles, you could say. And it wasn't unique in that, the banks were doing exciting things, and to do exciting things, you need to hire smart people and give them the chance to do some smart things. And that was a really exciting environment to be working in. It's a bit different now with the credit crunch and everything else. And the regulatory environment is different, but I absolutely loved it. And I was developed first of all, as a developer, and then as a manager. And I think as a person, as a result of my time at Swiss Bank and then UBS. So it's unfortunate that it ended in the way that it did. But I certainly don't regret my career there. Nor do I regret leaving it either. I've gone on to do some other interesting and exciting things. So that's cool.
So are you telling us that the Agile can even be done in investment banking as well? That's what I'm hearing.
It absolutely can. I mean, I was kind of shocked to find that, doing things in any other way was even a thing, We did some remarkably big things with, really the minimum of sort of project management, program management and things like that. We delivered some big things that had impact right from front office right through to back office, where it was mostly done through teams talking to each other. People taking responsibility. It wasn't through following a project plan.
Right.
It was through each team having its own strategy and then making sure that it was adequately aligned to the strategies of people upstream and downstream of them. And where the business got involved and project management got involved often wasn't in the delivery part, in the technology part, but was in things like testing. And they were amazing at throwing, experienced people from the business, seconding them into some of these critical projects just to take responsibility for things like testing. We were smart about how we did our implementations. Nothing got implemented big bang if we could help it. And it gives you a chance to put proper business controls around implementation and so on. So these things weren't managed, the implementations weren't managed like technology rollouts typically are.
Right.
But the development teams were given the opportunity to do their best. That's how I thought everybody did it.
Yeah.
It was quite a shock to find out that it's actually not normal. So I've been very fortunate actually to have worked with some of the best organizations in the world in that respect. Yeah.
You don't know what you have or what privilege you're entitled to until you find out otherwise, right? So
it really shocks me when people talk about scaling agile as though that implies adding a whole lot more layers of management, centralizing work breakdown structures, adding more layers into the decision-making process and so on. It really shocks me. It's just so not necessary. That might represent a small improvement for organizations that have got a long way to go. But as a way of scaling up something that is actually working for people, and Agile really does work for teams incredibly well, it seems pretty boneheaded to me. So it's not to say there's no value at all in those scaling frameworks. I think they demonstrate some things that are possible. But I am so anti, as I've said already, the idea of just rolling these things out. Rolling things out is a recipe for pain, not for success.
True. And I remembered one of the Agile coaches that I talked with. He was telling me that I'm a pain reliever, because that's what the Agile rollout typically is in the organization. They roll out and people go through pain, and I'm just there to help them to go through that pain.
Yeah, but inflicting pain because the process, because the framework says this is what you should do, that's unnecessary pain. I mean, it's a much more productive way of achieving transformation is actually use tools that help you find the dysfunctions in an organization. There are some great tools for doing that. And not just at team level. We're looking at how the relationships between levels of the organization work, looking at how collaboration works between teams, looking at movement between teams, sharing of responsibility, sharing of knowledge, all these kinds of things. You don't actually need a big and heavy framework to do it. That's a lazy shortcut and one that brings as much pain as it does benefit, in my opinion.
So what do you need to have as a leader?
Well, that's a big question. As that kind of gets me onto what I'm up to at the moment. So Agenda Shift has been going since 2015, 2016, that sort of time frame. And last year we launched the Agenda Shift Academy, and it's already undergone a bit of a pivot. It was very much it's kind of the first iteration was kind of a product of lockdown. What we've done is working out alternative ways of delivering what is mostly a workshop-based thing. As not just Zoom-based workshops, which we've done very successfully actually, but also as self-paced training, which is an interesting new thing to do. The first iteration was very much based on existing material and more focused at practitioners than at leaders. And now, the strapline for the academy now, or as of a couple of weeks' time, at least when we relaunch, is leadership and strategy for the transforming organization, or leadership and strategy in the transforming organization. It's really aimed at anyone who needs to be a leader, who needs to participate in change, participate in the strategy process, participate in the transformation process. And, starts with a gentle foundational level introduction, which, leaders at any level of the organization and almost any level of interest can take, and it helps to prepare the ground for what we might do later in terms of change and transformation and strategy. And then depending on the different interests that you have, there are different tracks you can go down: inside out strategy, outside in strategy, and adaptive organization. And what we're teaching people is kind of the language of outcomes. How can leaders actually engage with other people, engage with teams, engage with other parts of the organizations, and make sure that we are getting to where we need to get to in terms of the outcomes we want to achieve. And there's various patterns that we that we teach. So sort of structures to conversations, which might be just literally a few questions and answers, or it might be like a day's worth of workshop. These are patterns, not prescriptions. And then it fits really well with various well-known leadership models. Servant leadership, host leadership, leader, clear leadership is another one I've only recently getting into. But so many of these models are about getting away from command and control. And when you look at how adaptive organizations work, you realize that they don't rely on command and control. It doesn't scale. There's no way that in a dynamic environment, a leader can know more than everybody else. There's no way that a leader can control everybody. Especially when people are trying to respond to a dynamic and changing environment. So they've got to work in better ways, and they've got to rely on being clear about outcomes. We sometimes talk about intent-based leadership, for example, but very much the same idea. And also they've got to build trust, and everyone's got to be, happy that what they think is happening is what is actually happening. And that's true for staff, it's true for leaders. People need to be clear as they need to be about what the strategy is. Leaders need to be clear as they need to be about what's happening, but also give people the space to get on with it, to be creative, to do their best, and all the rest of it. Confident that if something bad's happening, if something that we don't understand is happening in the environment, that our customers responding in a strange way, for example, then the right people will get to hear it. That's sort of two of the three pillars of leadership, at least as identified in one of the key models that we use. And the third pillar is calibration. That's making sure we've got the right level of focus. Something that Lean understands very well, Scrum to an extent as well. What's the right level of focus to have as a team? Are we trying to do, focus on that one critical thing because, our survival depends on it, or is it let 1,000 flowers bloom because we don't know where the next innovation is going to come from? Different organizations, different times, different seasons of the year even need different levels of focus, and management is about providing just the right amount of space, or leadership is about providing just the right amount of space. Give people the room to perform, but don't give them so much space that they lose heart, lose control, lose their grip on what they're trying to do, and so on. Again, things that Lean, Agile, Scrum, Kanban all have the tools to help do at team level. And then we look at how some of the principles of that apply at higher levels, and how you get the relationship between levels of the organization working effectively, and so on. So a lot of stuff there. It's all intertwined. It's leadership, it's organization design, it's organization development, it's a bit of process, a bit of structure. But it sounds complicated, it sounds rich, but actually it boils down to just a few things. And the beauty of it is that those things apply perhaps in slightly different ways, but they apply at every level of the organization. And we're not just sort of taking a process and scaling it up and making it bigger, heavier, clumsier, slower.
Right.
We're applying principles at each level of the organization. And that's the way to identify the dysfunctions and to make things work better, help the organization be more agile.
Right. And this leadership training or education that you guys are developing is not focused only on the big L leaders in the organization. So any person in the organization is recommended to take that one, because everyone would be a leader, right?
So our goal is, we want most people with leadership aspiration or leadership responsibility to take it, because it's helping prepare the ground for participation, for strategy, for transformation. So for example, if you've got a team, if you're a team leader, I feel that every team deserves the opportunity to express its own strategy. Otherwise, strategy is just something that happens to you. And if strategy is something that only ever happens to you, how can you claim to be an autonomous team? And if you don't have autonomy, how can you claim to be agile? You know, it just doesn't work. You know, and this is why I'm big on things like OKR, not because I love structure and process and so on, but because it's a simple, elegant way of teams of teams, every level of the organization, to express its own strategy succinctly and in its own words, and in ways that it's easy to negotiate with other people that care about what you're doing. So much more powerful, scales so much better than, you know, bigger, more complex backlogs, project plans, roadmaps, and so on. I mean, those things all have their place. But if you deny teams and teams of teams and so on the opportunity to express their own strategy and to take responsibility for it and to be accountable for it and to be rewarded for it and all the other things that go with organizational life, there's something a bit wrong. And actually the organizational theory will tell you that there is something wrong. It's not just because, you know, I think OKR is a cool tool. You know, there's a real principle there, the principle about getting the balance right between autonomy and coherence in the organization. And just adding more process doesn't really address that balance adequately.
There are lots to talk here. I still want to talk about the Kanban value YouTube video that I saw from you, right? And there are a lot that is coming up. So I hope that we can cover most of it. But the one thing that is I keep comes to my mind. I want to ask from Mike, like how one can become Mike. So you from
attend my training, obviously.
No, for sure. But from Kanban from inside, agenda shift, right to left. And there's a new book coming and working with ODs, right? Organizational design people. Like that's the missing piece that typically when you get to the development or changes in the large organization at the bigger picture, you figure out, oh, there are some people that called OD, they're working the organization. We Agile people never talk to them. But you mentioned that they ask you to write a book, right? So yes. Tell us what is this secret sauce for you? What is the success recipe for Mike or someone that wants Mike to become the next Mike? I'm not sure if it's possible or not, but.
Well, I can tell you some of the things that I did, and you know how repeatable that process is. You know, who knows? So the trick I pulled off with Kanban from the inside and with the values model was abstracting the principles and practices to produce the values. Mm-hmm. And abstracting them was actually useful because you see really what's underlying them. But also it's really useful because it gives you so much opportunity to talk and write and develop the ideas than I could possibly have done with the principles and practices. To be blunt, writing about principles and practices is boring. I mean, let's be honest about it. You know, it's the nuts and bolts. You know, it kind of has to be done, and to an extent, I address those in the book. But talking about the values was so much more exciting because you start to think about how the values can apply in different contexts. Mm-hmm. And you can think about how values might be in tension with each other, and you know, it gives you so much more freedom, so much more latitude. And I use the values to integrate lots of things. Kind of the middle third of the book is kind of referencing all the other things that are outside of Kanban that actually have something useful to contribute. So we talk about lean, we talk about agile, we talk about theory of constraints, we talk about systems thinking, and so on and so on and so on. And you can take each of those models, which you all know have valuable things to offer, and you can ask yourself, well, what do they look like when you approach them from the perspective of values in general, but also specifically, you know, the 9 values of the model. And, you know, if they've got useful things to say in relation to those values, well, let's talk about them. And you start to integrate, and it starts to get so much less about, you know, one framework, whether it's Kanban or Scrum or SAFe or whatever it might be, being the, you know, the be all and end all of everything, and having your identity completely tied up with the framework. something I decided I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be seen just as the Kanban guy, but actually someone who integrated these things, opened the doors to people, and opened the door to myself as well, because all these things I integrate, I get to learn more and more things. And I find the models 2 and 3 removed from those and so on. And it does involve a lot of reading, got to say, I read voraciously. But it's a mindset of integration. What I've done with right to left and agenda shift is do that same integration trick, starting from the standpoint of outcomes rather than of values. So with right to left, I kind of did a whole survey of the lean agile landscape, the frameworks and all the models that contribute to the lean agile landscape, from the position of what if we put outcomes first? What if everything we did was always and consciously, deliberately focused on 2 things: achieving the outcome, or 3 things: achieving the outcome, proving that we've achieved it, and incorporating all the learning that we can possibly learn in the process of doing it. And in its a way, you could say that's quite a lean startup-y way of looking at agile, but actually it's just taking that's what I mean by the right to left perspective, starting on the right-hand side of the board, if you like. If you look, everything is visualized on a Kanban board. Start on the right-hand side, not just think about what we can get over the line, but make sure we're always reminding ourselves about what getting over the line actually means. Making the work more meaningful in the process, making sure we understand our customers' needs better, their struggles better, and so on. Making sure we're having the right conversations at the right time that are looking ahead to what follows happening smoothly, and the outcome being achieved, that learning being captured, and everything else. And the whole book really is based on that perspective, but we use that perspective on lots and lots of different things, and to help integrate them as well. So it's not a book about one particular framework. It's a book about lean and lean agile together, celebrating them separately and together, as I say in the book, from a coherent standpoint, and in a way that helps people integrate them, in a way that stops things being about just one framework. The world would be very, very dull if we're only ever allowed one framework. So that's the attitude there. And agenda shift is the same, but applied to change and transformation. So what if we have conversations about needs, outcomes, obstacles? How can we frame those into a strategy conversation? A strategy, whether it's about a customer strategy or an internal strategy, how do we respond to that? How do we organize ourselves around outcomes? Do we have the right outcomes that tell us that we're winning? It's outcomes everywhere, outcomes top to bottom, it's outcomes all the way down at every level of detail, and always the thing that we are focused on. And it's just so much better than focusing on rolling out practices, rolling out process, implementing organization change for its own sake. Starting from, let's have the conversations we need. Let's make sure we understand what it is our needs are, our struggles are, the things we hope for, the things that get in the way of what we hope for. Let's make sure we properly contextualize all that. Let's make sure that we organize the results of those conversations in a way that gives us a coherent strategy that we can measure our progress against. So that's what agenda shift is all about.
An outcome-oriented mindset, like to leadership, to change,
yes.
to processes.
Yes. So that's a bit different to a process-oriented mindset, which I think is where a lot of Agile is, or has been for 20 years. And I think that's unfortunate. It's not directly a people-oriented mindset, but it easily leads to one. And we do talk a lot about leadership. But leadership is very much a people-based thing. And so we get into things like the deliberately developmental organization, for example. That's Keegan and Leahy. So that's how do we make sure that we take our responsibility seriously to develop people, that we design organizations where people are naturally developing each other, and that organization development is, in a way, a side effect of that process. Well, that's one model that we integrate with all of the others. Things like team topologies, things like dynamic reteaming, things like sociocracy. All these models that help us look at organization and in a people-oriented way that respects complexity, respects that environments are dynamic, and actually integrates with the deeper organization theory, viable system model, and complexity, all these other things. Some of this stuff is really old. It goes back to the 70s, 60s even. Right. Some of this stuff is more recent. If you have a clear perspective on them, you start to recognize where the opportunities to integrate them is, where the synergies between these different models are, and so on.
I'm going to keep that in mind moving forward. That was a very useful phrase to say, integration mindset. Like that's what I'm going to have, because after listening to all these models, I'm like, yes, because last night I was talking to a dear friend and he was talking about business agility. I said, like, did you know that business agility in a way or form was even there before Agile in place? Like in 1999 they were referred to some. I'm like, yes, so it's just a rebranding of, and I love these models that you brought up. Like if you have understanding of the audience of our podcast, have the understanding of the different scaling models, you wouldn't hear any of, like, most of these models. They're different. It's just all about the process. Like do this, and we have the solution for you. Versus, like, for using these models, as you mentioned, you need to understand that these are the guidelines, these are the patterns to use, right? It's not we use this and you would be perfect. Like we are not.
It's not enough when you scale a process up. It's not enough that the model looks elegant. It's not enough that you can make a nice poster out of it. You've actually got to look at the needs of organization, the needs of organizations in general. And there's a lot of organization development research and a lot of systems research that gives you some very strong clues as to what a serious model for scaling needs to achieve. And you need to look in particular about what the organization itself needs. And organizations are all different. Industries vary very hugely. Organizations within the same industry can vary hugely. And the idea that the one model, one design, I should say, the idea that one design should work for all of them, and in particular one process design should work for all of them, that's pretty naive, I think. There are models that are universal, but those models aren't prescriptive. They are descriptive and diagnostic. They help tell you where you're going wrong. And that's the approach that we've taken with Agenda Shift, looking at models that really help us identify the pain points in organizations, the common mistakes and not so common mistakes that they make, and help them find better ways of organizing themselves, of doing things that takes away that pain. Not inflicting the pain, genuinely not inflicting the pain, and helping organizations help themselves, not just clearing up the mess after the Agile transformation.
I haven't took the Agenda Shift training or any of these things with Mike myself, but from reading the book, I can tell you that, for example, in the Agenda Shift, there is a technique is being used, clean language, that when you are talking to the leadership, like what exactly they are, and this clean language has been developed, I believe, part of a therapy domain, right? And then if you're knowledgeable about like other scaling Agile models, none of them is about like bringing clean language to that. Like, and that's how diverse and how vast is the tools that you're getting using out there and putting it together. So that's like putting these together. Like if you use clean language in the wrong place, like it's going to blow up, right? But it's using it like in the right place, it's going to help you deeply. And actually, that was my introduction to Agenda Shift. Can you believe it or not? I was reading about clean language, and we have plenty of Mikes in Canada. There's another Mike that he's a very good coach, and he mentioned that, Agenda Shift uses clean language as well. And I'm like, if it's coming from Mike Burrows, it might have been worth a read, and I'm glad.
It's
I'm
nice.
glad
It's
that
nice that it works that way, because I mean, sometimes agenda shift is, is the gateway drug to clean language for people. I know people that have gone from agenda shift to clean language and to other things as well.
right,
But you're right; it comes from the therapy world, and actually, quite a lot of tools in coaching do.
right,
So clean language, it comes from the therapy world. So does solutions focus. That's another important one. Coaching model, but before that, therapy model, and each of the frameworks. It's not just like a set of questions. It's not just a set of tools. There are some very important assumptions beneath them.
right,
When you understand those assumptions, you understand how and when it's appropriate, how to implement them, how to use them, and when it's appropriate to do so. So, with clean language, for example, the idea is when you ask a question to which you don't know the answer, make sure that your question doesn't imply what you think the right answer should be. Make sure that you don't pollute your questioning with your own assumptions. And the clean language questions, there are 40 or more of them, are just questions that have been honed and honed and honed over years to minimize the opportunity for you to introduce your own assumptions into the conversation. And that's actually respecting the person that you are talking to. It's giving them the opportunity to develop their own thoughts, their own models in their minds. But you can't talk in clean language all the time. That would be
right,
horrible. And actually, and this is kind of there's a really interesting leadership paradox in a way. When leaders are genuinely inquiring, being curious, and it's a good quality in leadership to be curious about what's going on in the mind of other people. At the same time, there may be anxiety on the part of the other person that, well, I don't know why he's asking these questions, what are the right answers and so on. So there's also a skill of leadership and being appropriately transparent about what's on your mind, and sharing what your experience of the situation is, and so on. This is recommend a book on this stuff, actually. Jervis Bush, Clear Leadership. I think I mentioned Clear Leadership earlier. But it's about being aware of yourself, aware of your own experience of the situation, being appropriately transparent about that, not always sort of let everything hang out, not wearing your heart on your sleeve, but giving enough insight into what you're thinking about that the person you're talking to feels safe to respond, and perhaps share in that same sort of way, or just follow the line of questioning. So it's being descriptive as well as curious. There's a quite interesting conundrum there. A leader isn't a therapist. I'm not a therapist. And the contract a leader has with a colleague is very different from the contract that a therapist has with their patient. Completely different. And I've made it very clear to myself and to others that I'm not a therapist, and I'm not going to cross a line into something that's going to be unsafe or create unnecessary levels of anxiety in the people that I'm talking to. And what we do with what we do with clean language is to turn it into a game, and that kind of makes it safe and okay to try things that normally you wouldn't try. So 15-minute photo from obstacles to outcomes in 15 minutes. It's amazing, actually, how many outcomes you can produce in 15 minutes if you've got the right questions to ask. So that's that. And it's there to teach not just the questions, but the principle of being careful about your assumptions when you're asking questions. And it's kind of the discipline of curiosity. But there are, other frameworks have some different underlying assumptions. Solutions focus, which is a slightly unfortunate name because it sounds like it's about imposing solutions, or it might imply that.
right,
But actually, its premise is, solutions are everywhere. They're at your fingertips. Wherever you look, there are things happening slightly better than you realized if only you knew where to look. And it's actually to help people get unstuck, and not to think that you have to implement the whole solution. It might be enough just to implement like the first 5%. The first, the typical question would be, what would be the first tiniest sign that something interesting has happened, or that the change has taken effect? And those first tiny signs are clues to what might already be happening, or clues as to the first small step that you can make, getting unstuck in that process and so on. So actually very complementary to clean language. I don't see them as things that are mutually exclusive. Start with small outcomes, then the conversation about outcomes is actually that much more interesting. You can ask, then what happens? That's a clean language question, and you get another outcome. Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens? That gets a bit monotonous if you only ask then what happens.
Right.
So what kind of, and where does that come from, and so on. And you can start to have a surprisingly rich conversation, even with only the few questions that were on the card for the game. And we set it up with a bit of solutions focus, maybe a bit of challenge mapping as well. That's from the OD world rather than the design world, rather than the therapy world. But some similar sort of ideas, some simple questions that make very few assumptions, and that's help. But the questions are still quite pointed. They do cause people to think, and they may come up with ideas that they never had before, and that makes these conversations creative. To use the technical term, generative questions, generative conversations, as part of a generative process where we are creating more ideas than we consume, and that's how. That's how exciting organizations sustain themselves.
We need to have you, I guess, for the Agile Games Canada as well. Like I remember, your Kanban game is becoming very popular. Like they built, and you are talking about this clean language game that I need to get my hands on.
There's at least 3 games from the AgendaShift camp. So if you go to agendashift.com/resources, you'll see FeatureBan, which was the original Kanban simulation. So the original. There are others, but FeatureBan is easy, cheap. It's Creative Commons. You can get hold of all the materials. ChangeBan, which is a more sort of lean startup and change focused version of FeatureBan, doesn't teach all that FeatureBan does. It doesn't cover things like metrics and so on. But getting people thinking in an interesting way about how to manage a portfolio of experiments, then that's cool. I actually use ChangeBan more than I use FeatureBan, but FeatureBan is still very popular. The other one is 15-minute photo, as you mentioned. So that's the clean language game. Possibly call it a game. Celebration 5W. It's my context capturing exercise. I use it at the beginning of almost every workshop I do. That's free as well. This week's blog was about Celebration 5W. That's the who, what, when, where, and why. The celebration you're going to have when you've made your next breakthrough. Really simple setup. Really easy to explain. You don't need fancy materials, although there are fancy materials if you want them. All open sourced. I've connected with so many more people through open sourcing things than I would have done if I'd made people pay for them.
Yeah, and the open source is not only for the software. Like you have done it for these games, right? So and I think the FeatureBan, you have not developed it, but someone else developed it, like the online version, like the idea.
Yes. Right. So the one of the Kanban tool vendors, Kai10, have done a online version of FeatureBan. So if you go to the FeatureBan page via the resources page, there's a link there to theirs. And actually, a member of the AgendaShift community, Tom Est, wrote himself a online ChangeBan as well. So you can do these things online, and the games are simple enough that you can do them in Miro or whatever as well. Lots of different ways of doing them. Doing it in the room is probably the most fun way of doing it with a printed board. We use cards now to inject the randomness into the game, and those are fun. It's all of these things. They go through a lot of community use and a lot of iteration. I've lost count of the number of iterations I've done on FeatureBan. ChangeBan's been through a few. Celebration 5W, that was version 7 I announced this week. I don't know what fits. Again, 15-minute photo, again, gone through lots of versions. These are used all the time. And what we're trying to do is maximize the valuable time that people have playing these games, minimize the effort required to set them up, and at the end of it, maximize the impact, the learning impact of these things as well. So whether that's built into the game or in terms of sharing practice about how we debrief them and take the learnings from them, So these are anything that I publish has been tried,
Right.
maybe only once, but it's been tried.
Right.
Most of by the time something ends up on the resources page, it's been used by other people, it's been tested, and once they've gone through multiple iterations, you can be pretty sure they're well tested, they're pretty reliable.
And you guys have a very good community on Slack on the Agenda Shift. There's a very lively community, and I think anyone can join that one as well, like to be part of those.
Yeah, again, agendashift.com/Slack, and request your invite that way. I think most of the Slack communities have quietened down a bit in the last few months. It was kind of where we lived during the first few lockdowns. And I did lean coffees as well on a regular basis. And particularly while people were on furlough or out of work, they were a lifeline. And even for me, they were they were one of the highlights of my week. The worst of the of lockdown and so on. I say even for me, I made a decision that I would do my utmost to put Agenda Shift on, make it as sustainable as an online business rather than I was globetrotting before too much. Before lockdown, the first lockdown, I had been to India, then Florida, and then Scandinavia just in a matter of weeks. And I came back from Scandinavia and quarantined myself because this was when people were starting to get worried, before lockdown was formal. And I decided a lot of people saying it'll just blow over. And of course, we know now that would have been the wrong decision to make, counting on it blowing over. And I made a decision even in that week of quarantine. We're talking like February, March of 2020, just almost 2 years ago. I decided I'm going to have to work out how to do this from home, and has some personal benefits for me. I've profoundly disabled daughter. With my wife, we are a full-time care team, and being at home is actually important to me. It's great for my wife and good for Florence. So every cloud has a silver lining, as they say, and for me, actually, this is how I want to work. And I'm not saying I'm glad that COVID happened, but it was the necessary. It created the necessary change for me and for the world. We all know now that online can work, and making it work. Yeah,
there were teams or organizations that I know of that they never thought of remotely working, but now like everyone's working, like there were no other option, like when you are forced into. So Mike, you talked about the Clear Leadership book. If people want, I want to ask you, what other books would you recommend if people want to start developing their, or material, not necessarily book, start their leadership skills? There's clearly the Clear Leadership is one of them that you mentioned. Is there any other one that you recommend?
Yeah, so I definitely would recommend Clear Leadership. So that's Jervis Bush, and he's actually one of the he's one of the two that commissioned the book that I'm writing. I'd also mention Mark McCurgow. So he's the co-author of two very interesting books. So one is Solutions Focus, which I've mentioned already. And he was co-author also of a book called, I think it's just called Host or Hosting, but it's about, the model is host leadership. And in the last few months, he's published in the same short series series of short books that I'm going to be publishing my short book in. He's published a short version of Host Leadership. So it's for those that are uncomfortable with the metaphor of servant leadership, it's a really interesting and really fresh and I think quite innovative new metaphor. And you think, well, I'm still a fan of servant leadership, but I think host leadership genuinely adds something interesting and important. And if you think about what a host is, think host for a dinner party or host for a workshop or whatever. You want people to come, to feel invited, to feel valued, to have a great time, if necessary, to have a productive time, for them to have the conversations that they need to have, not necessarily with you involved in every conversation. In fact, usually not with you involved in every conversation. You are creating an environment in which people can have an enjoyable, meaningful, productive time. And I find that a really fascinating idea. And it has really useful things to say about leadership. There's useful things to say about facilitation. And I'm kind of in a world that's sort of straddling both of those. So that's a really fascinating one. And then there's some classic ones as well, or modern classics. I really enjoyed Turn the Ship Around, David Marquette. I really enjoyed Team of Teams, Stanley McChrystal. But for getting into the sort of, perhaps a slightly more academic view of things, but I found very meaningful, those first two I mentioned, so Clear Leadership and Mark McCurgar's hosting books. And there's a bit further away from sort of traditional, agile stuff, and getting into some of the deeper stuff. There are decades of great work that's fully aligned with Agile, or does easily fully align with Agile. That too much of the Agile community is unaware of. And I can't expect everyone to have read every book. I'm not seriously suggesting that. But I am suggesting that it's wrong to think that, Agile has all the answers, that the Scrum Guide and the Agile Manifesto are the only two documents that you need. That just isn't true. If you're serious about leadership, if you're serious about organization, serious about anything, you've got to do some study, you've got to do your homework, and do some experiments of your own as well. But you'll learn so much more if, as well as trying things yourself, you are drawing on the theory that helps to explain what works and what doesn't work. So that's what being Mike's about. But that's learning, isn't it?
Right.
Learning, you try things and you try to understand, well, how and why did that work, or how and why didn't that work? And if you're smart, you borrow other people's learning as well.
Right. I once interviewed a startup CEO that the firm became so huge that is now like 250 people, so it's not a startup anymore. And we were talking about learning and how he applies the learning, and he told me that my technique is that whenever I read a book, I apply it right away. Like as long as I'm reading it, I'm applying it to the people that I'm working with, right? And the best way to learn, I guess that's right. Learn and experiment with that, right? So
yes, I think I would echo that actually. And if you keep on reading and you keep letting the good, I mean, you've got to tell the good books from the bad, of course, but if you let the good ones and the good thoughts of those good ones play with those, I mean, like Clear Leadership, it's the recent book that I've read, and it's had an impact on this conversation, and that's a good thing.
Thank you, Mike. So would you tell us a little bit about maybe a sneak peek into the next book that's coming up? You said the fourth one is coming.
Yeah, so working title, it's just a working title, is Patterns of Generative Conversations. That's quite an academic title, isn't it? I mean, there is another title that's so long I can't even remember it, which I hope we don't use, but that's the title I'm using. And it's kind of, you've read the Agenda Shift second edition. You may remember I did a reconciliation of Agenda Shift with a model called the Generative Change Model. So that's Jervis Bush. He's very much from the academic OD world. He's a professor in Canada, so a compatriot of yours. And the correspondence between Agenda Shift and the generative change model was like almost one for one. I mean, pretty much one for one if I looked at it the right way. And they were developed completely independently. And so it's kind of remarkable that the correspondence should be so strong. So, but the Agenda Shift book was very much about Agenda Shift, and the generative change model, is like half a chapter. And they're kind of turning inside out now and describing the generative change model, but using Agenda Shift to illustrate it, is what the new book is. Now, the cool thing about the series that it's being published in, this BMI series in organization development, is that they're 30,000 words, 100 pages. That's quite short. So you know, it's a nice way. And there's a range of books all related to dialogic and generative organization development. Organization development that's not about rollout. It's not about diagnosis and prescription. It's about helping organizations have the conversations they need to have and helping themselves, experimenting, changing, all those kind of things. And the different books address different, either looking at it from a different angle, so like my book does, or like Mark McCogal's book does, looking at it from a hosting perspective, or they address particular points in like that process. So how does an external practitioner engage with the organization? How do you set up a steering group, or whatever you want to call the group of people that you're going to be most closely working with when you're involved in some kind of transformation, and so on and so on. So some of those are case study based. Some of them, some like mine, are more model based. Based on, in my case, based on models, patterns, and exercises. In Mark McCogal's case, based on his hosting metaphor and the various things that various sort of dimensions of leadership that he draws out, from that metaphor. So that's the series. Be published under an academic label, but ironically, it might be one of my most readable books. At 100 pages, it's. I could go down the very dense and very academic, but it's not going to be that. It's not going to be that at all. It's going to be a nice short book that will give you an overview of the generative change model and of agenda shift, both at the same time, with a facilitator's mind, with the facilitator as the audience mostly, but there'll be some leadership aspects in there as well. I mean, you can't engage with organizations and not care about leadership. So I think most chapters will end with some thoughts, relevant thoughts on leadership. So that's the plan. I've written the introduction in chapter 1. I think 7 chapters in total. In terms of word count, I think I'm about 20% of the way. I started over the Christmas holiday, but it's going to be slower going now. Now we're back at work, so it'll be published sometime this year. I wouldn't like to be more specific than that.
Looking forward. Every of your book was very easily readable for me, so that's a bonus.
Good.
For everyone that wants
to. I'll try.
yeah, thank you so much. So Mike, is there anything that we wanted to talk about and we didn't get a chance to talk about? Anything else that you want to mention?
I don't know what we've covered the main books. I suppose I have dropped a big hint already, but the big thing that's happening in the next couple of weeks for me is the new Leading with Outcomes Foundation. So foundation is the name of the foundation module. It's not a foundation. The foundation module of a whole new curriculum on leading with outcomes. So we're very excited about that. Very excited about the sort of pivot to leadership and strategy in the transforming organization. So we're no longer aiming primarily at practitioners. That's not to say that practitioners won't take a lot from it, but we really want to hit a broader audience, and we think we'll help practitioners in the process. So we hope that actually the practitioner community will be our allies in this, and we're going to, with things like affiliate programs and things like that, we'll actually make it possible for practitioners even to participate commercially with us as we reach their client organizations. So that's the plan. That's the way to make Mike scalable, you could say. Self-paced training, and then we'll follow that up over the course of the year with more self-paced modules and workshops as well. Workshops have been on hold for the last embarrassing number of months while we've been working on the self-paced stuff. Kind of came to the conclusion that it would be confusing to be launching workshops based on an old curriculum while we are working on launching the new one. So we decided we would just put the workshops on hold. I'm really looking forward to getting back to doing workshops again. I absolutely love doing them. So that will be in the next few weeks.
Right, and you would provide those information and put those on the podcast notes, so people would be able to look at those links and join. So it's amazing to have a self-paced one for the people across the world to join, and whenever they have a chance. But a workshop experience is a different thing, right?
Yes. So study and experience, that's at two sides of the same coin, really. I mean,
Right.
as we've already said, you kind of haven't really learned something until you've tested it and put it into practice.
Right.
Organizations talk a lot about learning, and quite often that means lessons learned, which is really just going over the mistakes that we make time and time again. That's not learning at all. You really have got to try these things. You've got to change some assumptions, and try working in different ways.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, make sure you learn something in the process. That's the smart thing to do. So much value left on the table if you're not learning while you're doing anything new.
Yeah, for most of the organization, at least that I know of, is failure means put it under the rug and move on to the next thing. Don't go back and learn from it. See what assumption did we make, see what could we change in the assumption and try a different way, right? It's like, oh, we fail, like let's focus on something that we can succeed and talk about that, like, and forget about this.
Yes. So we need to design organizations so that they don't keep doing that, so they don't keep wasting learning. And they'll learn so much more about them, not just about themselves and their process, but learn more about their customers, their competitors, their opportunities, and so on, if they are properly set up to reap all of that. Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Thank you, Mike, a lot for spending time with me and talking to me. I really enjoyed our conversation, and
me too.
I hope the same as well for you. So I'll ask you for your contact info, and please tell to our audience how they, if and how they can contact you. Agentashift.com is one day.
I'm very easy to find. Agentashift.com and agentashift.com/Mike has my bio and so on. There's a contact page as well. We've mentioned Slack already. There's a LinkedIn group as well, Agenda Shift. And you can follow Agenda Shift Academy on LinkedIn as well. At the time that we're speaking, it's the 18th of January. We don't yet have a landing page for the new foundation module, and there can be big change happening to the Agenda Shift Academy site. So, I mean, you can take a look at academy.agendashift.com, but it's about to change. But if you're on our mailing list, so agendashift.com/subscribe, if you want to join that, you can be sure of hearing all of the the developments as they happen. Very exciting time for us. So last year was the year not to waste, with a new book, new second edition coming out, and this is the year for really capitalizing on everything we started last year. So exciting times.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.